At 81 years old, Patti LaBelle sits in a room that feels almost too quiet for a woman who has spent her life inside thunder. No stage lights, no wardrobe racks, no glamour. Just a legend in a plain chair finally ready to loosen a promise that has choked her for nearly 40 years. Moments earlier she had tried to explain it, her voice low, steady, almost resigned. What's happening with Patti, she says, is that Patti is letting go of all those lies and saying what's really on my heart. I can only take but so much, and I can only do but so much. They ask if she thinks about it often. She shakes her head slowly. I can go months without thinking about it, she insists, because I truly believe I'm going to be here. But as the cameras roll, that confidence begins to tremble at the edges. She leans forward, eyes suddenly sharp with memories she has spent decades trying to lock away, and she whispers the sentence that freezes everyone else in the studio. I have to say this, she murmurs, because Luther isn't here to free himself anymore. It isn't a confession. It isn't revenge. It's a doorway. A doorway back to a night she once swore she would never describe on record. A night that, according to those closest to her, only 2 people on earth ever truly witnessed. A night built on fear, on loyalty, and on something so raw, the industry did everything it could to scrub its fingerprints from history. People behind the scenes have long said that the Grammys never wanted this story told. Those who worked around Motown claimed they definitely didn't want this story reaching daylight either. But Patti is 81 now, and she is done protecting a silence she believes helped destroy him. Tonight, she says, she will tell the truth about Luther Vandross. To understand the secret, Patti is finally willing to reveal the story drags us backward more than half a century to the places where both of their ghosts were quietly formed. Because before they were icons shaping black soul, they were 2 lonely children who learned too early that music can rescue a voice and still ruin a person. Luther Vandross entered the world on April 21, 1951, on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, in a neighborhood that smelled like rain-soaked brick-hot metal and overheated radiators. By the time he turned 8, the apartment felt smaller, quieter, colder in a way that had nothing to do with weather. That winter his father died, suddenly leaving behind a grieving wife, 4 children, and a piano that became the only warm thing left in the room. Luther clung to music, not just because he loved it, but because it was the only thing that didn't leave. He studied singers with a surgeon's precision: Sarah Vaughan, Dionne Warwick, Aretha Franklin. He played records until the grooves thinned, memorizing every breath, every vowel, every microscopic moment of control. By the early 1960 essays, Motown was reshaping American culture, one hit at a time. Luther was quietly reshaping himself into something he hoped the world might one day accept, though he never truly believed it would love him back. Perfection hardened into armor. Loneliness sank into his shadow and stayed there. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, Patricia Louise Holty, born May 24, 1944, was learning a different language of survival. Her childhood unfolded between the wooden pews of Beulah Baptist Church and the tightening ache of constant loss. Relatives, friends, neighbors, someone was always sick, always dying, always disappearing. Patti learned to love people with urgency because life kept reminding her she might not get to keep them. Singing was not a fantasy. It was oxygen. Her voice was raw, jagged, undeniably powerful, the kind of sound that forced attention whether people were ready or not. She wasn't smooth like the carefully trained church soloists beside her. She was electric, and the congregation felt it in their bones. But very few understood the cost. Every note came from a wound that never fully closed. What neither Luther nor Patti knew was that their separate storms were slowly, inevitably pulling them toward the same sky. 2 lonely children who would one day dominate the same industry, orbiting each other for years like distant planets, close enough to feel the pull, too afraid to collide. Their paths finally crossed in the early 1970s, inside a smoky rehearsal studio on West 54th Street in Midtown Manhattan. It was August 1974, a sticky, heavy summer day when the city buzzed with fatigue. Patti had just left a tense meeting with her label. Luther, then 23, was rehearsing background parts for Roberta Flack's upcoming session. He wasn't famous. Most of the room barely registered him. But Patti noticed him immediately. Not because he was confident, he wasn't. Not because he was loud, he barely spoke at all that day. She noticed him because of the way he stood in the corner, body, coiled shoulders, tight eyes glued to the floor until someone casually asked him to sing. When he opened his mouth, the air in the room shifted. Later, Patti would describe it as hearing velvet break smooth, yet cracking, soft, yet trembling, beautiful, yet terrified of itself. Luther sang one line, then looked away fast, almost ashamed of having taken up space. Patti walked over, placed a hand on his shoulder, and he flinched, as if her touch had exposed something he had spent years burying. From that moment on, fans and even fellow musicians started noticing something strange whenever the two of them appeared in the same space. At the Apollo, in 1976. At an industry event hosted by Clive Davis in 1979. At an after-party for Bowie's Young Americans. Luther never behaved normally around Patti. He wasn't flirtatious. He wasn't casual. He wasn't relaxed. His entire posture changed when she walked into a room. Some people said he looked mesmerized. Others swore he looked angry. But almost everyone agreed he looked different. And the whispers began. Quietly at first, a few murmurs backstage, a couple of comments in van rides between venues, some long suspicious glances in dim studio hallways. Why did Luther seem so anxious around Patti? Why did he dodge her eyes on some days and stare too long on others? Why did his voice tighten every time she complimented him? Patti never addressed it in public. The industry built its own stories around them, some cruel, some simply wrong, but all orbiting the same unspoken center. People close to him said Luther saw something in Patti he didn't yet have the courage to see in himself. Marcus Miller, one of his closest musical partners, has long recalled how deeply Luther admired Patti, so deeply it almost frightened him to share a stage with her. And that wasn't considered an exaggeration. Luther adored precision and control. Perfection to him was safety. But Patti represented something he could never quite perfect. She was raw. She was emotional. She was unfiltered and unafraid. She sang like someone who had already survived the worst. Luther, for all his genius, often sang like someone bracing for the worst to arrive tomorrow. Their energies clashed and then locked together at the same time. She embodied freedom. He embodied fear. And fear almost always gravitates toward the person who threatens to expose it. Patti admits now, at 81, that she sensed it immediately. I knew he wasn't happy, she recalls, not with judgment, but with a grief that still sounds fresh after all these years. She saw the sadness in the way he moved, the childhood loneliness, still wrapped around the grown man, the perfectionism that didn't look like ambition so much as punishment. And she noticed something else, something she never spoke of publicly until now. Every time Luther's eyes met hers, there was a question in them. Not about fame, not about success, but about whether someone like him deserved to be truly seen. That fragile, electric, unspoken connection is what leads directly into the night Patti has avoided describing for 4 decades. The night she is finally willing to bring into the light. The night that in her mind explains everything. The night that changed the way she looked at Luther Vandross forever. If the music industry ever had a rumor it tried to hide beneath velvet curtains and polite smiles, it was this one. The idea that Luther Vandross, the perfectionist, the gentleman, the soft-spoken architect of 1980 SR&B, was secretly jealous of Patti LaBelle. It didn't start in tabloid headlines. It started in whispers from people who watched them work. From producers sitting in the shadows of control rooms. From backup singers leaning against hallway walls. From soul forums years later, replaying grainy clips and dissecting every frame of every performance they ever shared. And it began long before Patti would even come close to admitting what she now edges toward at 81. The first visible spark, fans say, came on October 1, 1986, during a charity concert in Los Angeles. Luther and Patti were scheduled to do a If Only You Knew, and A House Is Not a Home, a pairing that felt almost too powerful for one stage. The moment Patti stepped into her opening note, the cameras caught something odd. Luther's fingers started tapping against the microphone, nervous, restless. His jaw tightened at the exact second a crowd erupted for Patti's entrance. To this day, fan communities still circulate freeze frames of that night circling the same instant in red. Luther glancing sideways at her, admiration in his eyes, laced with a flicker of something sharper, something harder to name. For years, fans claimed he couldn't stand hearing audiences call Patti the greatest female voice alive. The words weren't an insult to him, but the compliment aimed at her seemed to land on him like a bruise. People inside the business added their own observations. They said that whenever Luther and Patti shared a duet, he would instinctively pull back some of his own flourishes. Not, they insisted, because he wanted her to shine, but because he wanted to control how she shined. Musicians who played with him have long said that Luther sometimes nudged the key signatures lower so Patti couldn't soar as recklessly high. Engineers quietly reported that he requested very specific microphone blends, keeping their harmonies tighter, more contained, less explosive. It was never described as sabotage. It was described as fear disguised as musical discipline. His need to tame the chaos of a voice that didn't know how to be small. Some fans pushed the theory even further, whispering that Luther's jealousy wasn't the jealousy of rivalry at all. They said it was the jealousy of someone who cared too deeply, too silently. Not romantic love, according to those who were there, but the kind of emotional attachment that forms when two wounded souls mirror each other too closely. People who watched them up close said Luther adored Patti, almost worshipped her. But they also believed he resented the way she moved through the world without apology, without visible shame, without trimming herself down to fit anyone's comfort. In other words, they said Luther didn't envy her talent as much as he envied her freedom. And Patti, when asked about those rumors over the decades, always responded the same way. She smiled politely. She shifted the conversation. She laughed it off and said, "No, baby. Me and Luther were good." But now at 81, she no longer hides behind diplomacy. She says the line that rearranges the entire story. "He wasn't jealous of me," she explains quietly. "He was jealous of what I allowed myself to be, and he couldn't." People who loved Luther, people who toured with him and worked beside him, have echoed that same emotional fault line. Gladys Knight, who shared stages with him in the late 1980s, has described him as brilliant, sensitive, and terrified of letting anyone down. Dionne Warwick once admitted that Luther could be hurt by something as small as a whisper. And Aretha Franklin, who respected him deeply but also clashed with him in private, was known to say he feels everything 10 times deeper than anybody else. That was the context almost no one understood in real time. Luther wasn't jealous because Patti was better. He was jealous because Patti was brave. Brave in her voice. Brave in her choices. Brave in her mess. Brave in her truth. All the things Luther, with his lifelong hunger for approval and safety, never truly believed he had permission to be. And that emotional collision, envy, fear, admiration, longing, created a tension between them that no one had the language to name. Not until now. For every rumor about Luther's jealousy, there was a quieter, harsher truth buried underneath it. Luther Vandross was profoundly, painfully alone. Not alone in the poetic sense. Alone in a way that shaped how he breathed, how he ate, how he slept, how he moved through every day of his life. Throughout the 1980s, as his fame exploded, never too much in 1981, Here and Now, in 1989, Luther walked the world in a body that he felt betrayed him in front of everyone. Reporters fixated on his weight. Headlines joked. Profiles praised him 1 month for slimming down, then mocked him the next when he gained it back. To the public, the fluctuations became spectacle. For a black male artist trying to survive inside a white-controlled industry, obsessed with image, that kind of scrutiny cut deeper than most people realized. It was said that before tours, Luther would starve himself, cutting down, shrinking, pushing his body into something closer to what the cameras demanded. Then when the shows ended and the hotel rooms went quiet, he would binge in secret. He avoided mirrors when he could. He ducked cameras between takes. He sidestepped interviews that edged too close to his insecurities. The world saw a polished icon in tailored suits and immaculate staging. Patti saw a man swallowing shame that was never his to carry. But the worst loneliness did not come from his reflection. It came from the questions he refused to answer. The ones about love, about relationships, about whether there was someone waiting for him at home. Whenever interviewers pushed, Luther smiled. He joked. He deflected with charm so smooth it felt like a rehearsed song. Now at 81, Patti finally says out loud what she always sensed in the spaces between his jokes. He didn't avoid talking about love because of scandal. He avoided it because love terrified him. He wasn't hiding a wild secret romance, she suggests. He was hiding the fear that he might be unlovable. That fear clung to him everywhere he went, even on nights that should have made him feel untouchable. Like the night of May 15, 1993, when he sold out Madison Square Garden. 22,000 people packed into the arena. Luther glided through his ballads with that velvet voice the world claimed as its own. Couples swayed in the aisles. Hands clasped. Grown men wiped tears from their faces as "A House Is Not a Home" echoed through the rafters. It was the kind of night most artists dream of once and never touch. On paper, it was perfect. But perfection is heavy, sometimes so heavy it breaks the person carrying it. The show ended at 10:44 p.m. The crowd spilled out into the New York night, buzzing, laughing, calling, cabs humming his melodies under their breath. Backstage assistants moved quickly, garment bags swinging bottled water, lined up congratulations flying in from every direction. Yet one door stayed closed longer than usual. Luther's dressing room. Stagehands assumed he was changing. Band members figured he needed a few quiet minutes. His manager believed he was just catching his breath. No one knocked. No one checked. Except Patti. She had watched the show from the wings, almost hidden, because no matter how complicated things became between them, part of her always felt responsible for him. Not as a rival. Not as a co-star. As someone who had seen the child still living behind his eyes. Her heels echoed down the concrete hallway, the last roar of the crowd still vibrating inside her chest. When she pushed open his door, the room was dark, except for the harsh glow of the mirror bulbs. And there he was, Luther Vandross, the giant, the velvet architect of slow jams and wedding vows, sitting on the floor in a full tuxedo, back against a cabinet, head bowed. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't tearing anything apart. He was breaking quietly, the way strong people sometimes collapse when they're too exhausted to pretend for one more minute. Patti froze in the doorway. Then she crossed the room and sank down beside him on the carpet. "Baby," she whispered. He didn't look at her, didn't lift his head. His eyes were red. His hands shook. Minutes passed without words, just the muted hum of the arena cooling down beyond the walls. She placed her palm gently against his back. He inhaled sharply, like the touch had cracked something open he had fought for years to keep sealed. And then, for what Patti remembers as the first and only time in his life, Luther Vandross told someone the truth he had hidden from the world. A sentence so soft she had to lean closer to catch it. A sentence she refused to repeat on talk shows, refused to share in glossy magazine spreads, refused to let the world chew up as gossip. What she guarded for almost 30 years she now finally speaks. "I know I'm not going to live long," she remembers him whispering. Patti says her chest tightened, confusion and fear crashing together. She asked him why say something that final, that dark, on a night when the entire city had just worshipped him. Luther finally looked up, eyes shining under the fluorescent light, and added the rest, "'Cause I feel myself disappearing. People don't see me. They see the voice." There was no scandal in that confession, no secret lover exposed, no shocking twist for tabloids to feed on. Just a man admitting a truth that had followed him since childhood. He did not believe he had the right to exist beyond what people expected him to give. Patti recalls him telling her he was tired. Not tired like someone who just finished a long show. Tired in his spirit. Tired of the pressure. Tired of the isolation. Tired of living inside a body he felt betrayed him. Tired of smiling through interviews. Tired of chasing perfection. Tired of performing strength he didn't actually feel. She held him that night in a dark dressing room at Madison Square Garden, while the cheers faded into the city outside, while in his own mind the greatest voice of a generation whispered that he felt doomed. She promised him she would never repeat that sentence. Never hand his most fragile confession to a world that loved his songs more than his silence. And for 4 decades she kept that promise. Only now, at 81, does she allow herself to break it, not to expose him, not to build a scandal, but because she believes people must know the price he paid to sound perfect. That night didn't end with theatrics. There were no dramatic exits, no shattered glasses, no headlines. They sat together until almost midnight. The hallway went quiet. Venue workers clocked out and disappeared into the city. Before she left, Luther squeezed her hand, looked at her with that same wounded softness, and said a line that branded itself into her memory. "Don't let them turn me into a statue, Patti. I'm tired of being frozen." Then he asked her to keep his fear between them. She did. Until now, 10 years after that night at Madison Square Garden, the thing Luther had whispered in the dark began to look less like fear and more like prophecy. April 16, 2003. 1:23 a.m. Luther Vandross suffered the stroke that would change everything. The news tore through the industry like a siren. Phones lit up. Reporters scrambled. Fans prayed in bedrooms and living rooms across the country. Radio stations slipped into marathon mode, spinning his records back to back, as if the sound of his own voice might somehow pull him back. Patti LaBelle was among the first to reach the hospital. She remembers the hallway more than anything. The sterile brightness that felt almost violent after a life spent under warm stage lights. The cold hardness of the floor tiles beneath her heels. The rhythmic beeping of machines, leaking through closed doors, each tone a reminder that bodies, even legendary ones, could fail without warning. A nurse recognized her instantly, but didn't gush, didn't chatter. She just nodded, solemn and respectful, and pushed open a door. Inside, Luther lay unconscious. Tubes stretched across his bedside like tangled wires from a story he no longer had the strength to narrate. His chest rose and fell barely. His eyelids fluttered in fragments like a man caught between 2 worlds. But the room itself felt frozen, as if time had agreed to stop for a moment and acknowledge the weight of his silence. They would not allow visitors in yet, so Patti pressed her hand against the glass. Tears slid down her face, and she realized she wasn't crying because she was certain he would die. She was crying because she recognized the expression resting on his features. It was the same expression she had seen in 1993, the night he said he didn't think he would live long, the night he told her he felt invisible. For the first time standing in that hospital corridor, Patti wondered if he had known something she didn't. She wasn't alone in that realization. The industry had already watched too many giants crack beneath the same relentless pressure. Whitney Houston, struggling to breathe beneath a fame that clung to her like a chokehold. Chaka Khan battling addiction while still being asked to deliver perfect notes on imperfect nights. Tina Marie worn down by a system that praised her voice but ignored the toll on her body. Black showbiz, as people behind the scenes often said, was a kingdom